All right, so we're diving back into this Canadian boycott of American products. It's been, what, about 2 months since we first chatted about this over on Le Podcast de Philippe.
Yeah, about that. And we've got some interesting early data starting to trickle in.
We'll be breaking down how things are playing out for Canadian consumers and businesses, the impact on both sides of the border for U.S. and Canadian industries, and what this all might mean down the line for that, always evolving economic relationship between Canada and the U.S. So stick with us as we sort through all this new info. And hey, if you like these deep dives, a quick reminder to head over to YouTube and help us hit that 1,000 subscriber mark. Your support means a lot to us.
Absolutely. Okay, so jumping right in, what's really noticeable right off the bat is this shift in Canadian buying habits.
Definitely seeing that.
There's this pretty clear preference emerging for stuff made right there in Canada. We're seeing a lot more people using those apps that help them identify Canadian products when they're shopping.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how quickly people have started using those, right? And it seems like supermarkets are making it easier too, putting labels and displays out there to highlight Canadian-made stuff. You can really sense this push to support the national economy.
For sure. And it's not just about individual shoppers either. We're seeing early signs of businesses starting to adjust their supply chains. Seems like the idea is to rely less on those American suppliers.
Which, long-term, could be a pretty smart move for Canada's economic stability, right? Even if there are some upfront costs involved.
Exactly. You're trading those short-term costs for potentially more control and independence in the future.
And there are reports that the Canadian government's getting involved too, trying to encourage more domestic sourcing and, a move away from relying so heavily on American imports. So it's really a two-pronged effort here, both from consumers and the government.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right?
Right.
The sheer scale of the economic ties between the two countries.
Absolutely. I mean, the U.S. is still Canada's biggest trading partner by a mile. Replacing all those American goods, especially in areas like agriculture, because people got to eat and they want variety, and the auto industry, which is so deeply integrated across borders, well, that's a huge task.
It's not like flipping a switch, that's for sure.
And it looks like this shift is already starting to affect Canadian shoppers' wallets a bit.
Yeah, there are signs of potential price increases. As those American products are swapped out with either local options or stuff from other countries, some things might get more expensive, especially in those categories where the U.S. has been, the main supplier for a long time, which obviously raises questions about, well, how affordable and available are these alternatives actually going to be for folks?
And the automotive sector is a perfect example of just how complicated this can get. It's so intertwined, with parts and vehicles constantly flowing back and forth across the border. A long-term boycott could really mess things up financially and logistically.
No doubt. And we're already seeing the effects on the U.S. side, too. American exports to Canada are down, and even a small percentage drop means a big chunk of potential revenue lost for U.S. businesses. There are reports of fewer orders for things like wine, liquor, appliances, even fresh produce.
It's not just theoretical either. We're hearing stories about real businesses feeling the pinch, like those wineries in Oregon, for example. They've been hit pretty hard with Canadian buyers canceling orders. It really puts a face on the impact this is having.
Right, and it's not just cancellations. Logistics companies are saying they're rerouting supply chains. Canadian businesses are looking at Europe or Asia instead of the U.S. for supplies. So we might be seeing a kind of reshuffling of global trade routes, which could have long-term consequences.
And it's not just about physical stuff either, right? Tourism's taking a hit too. Canadians might be choosing to vacation within Canada or travel to places other than the U.S. That could be a big blow to the American tourism industry, both in terms of revenue and jobs. And the overall numbers for international tourism to the U.S. are down too. Seems like a lot of that's due to fewer Canadians driving down.
Yeah, and the decline in tourism is really interesting. It seems like it's not just about money, but maybe a shift in how people feel about going to the U.S. right now. There's a sense of uneasiness that might be playing a role, on top of things like inflation making travel pricier in general. You see that with people from other countries too, like fewer folks from France coming over.
It seems like it's the smaller American businesses that are really in a tough spot.
Yeah, they just don't have the same kind of cushion as the big corporations do. Those bigger companies have more markets and more money to fall back on. But for smaller businesses that really depend on selling to Canada, this could be make or break time.
Especially if their Canadian customers were a big chunk of their business, right? They might not be able to ride this out if things stay slow for too long. Could even mean closing down and, people losing their jobs.
Absolutely. And there's another layer to this. The boycott seems to be feeding into a more negative view of American brands and products up in Canada. Even big, well-known names might have a harder time selling their stuff simply because they're American, especially if there are good Canadian or international alternatives available.
And you've got to think about the smaller businesses that sell online too, especially on those platforms that are facing boycott calls. They might be getting hit twice. People aren't buying American products, and some are even avoiding those whole platforms altogether.
Yeah, it really shows how this boycott is rippling outwards in all these different ways.
So zooming out, what's the big picture here? It seems like this Canadian boycott, while maybe not having a huge impact on the overall U.S. economy, is definitely causing problems in specific sectors and for those smaller businesses that rely on the Canadian market.
Right. The big corporations might come out okay, but the combined effect on smaller businesses in certain industries like agriculture and tourism, that could be significant. And beyond the economics, this boycott's a pretty loud political statement. It shows how Canadians are feeling about certain U.S. policies and this growing desire to be more economically independent. And the way Canadian consumers are embracing this, with the help of technology and those clearer product labels, well, it suggests this could be a real turning point in how they choose to spend their money.
So just to recap, we've seen how Canadian consumers are really making an effort to buy local, spurred on by tools like Canada and MapleScan and clearer labels in the supermarkets. This is definitely giving some Canadian industries a boost and creating the sense of, economic patriotism. But separating those deeply intertwined supply chains and finding replacements for all those American goods, well, that's not an easy feat. We saw how sectors like automotive and agriculture are running into roadblocks and how Canadian consumers might end up paying more for some things. And on the U.S. side, the impact is being felt especially by those smaller businesses that rely on the Canadian market. Those order cancellations, like the ones hitting Oregon wineries and the overall drop in exports to Canada, that's real economic pain. We also touched on how it's affecting bigger brands and even tourism, which points to a possible shift in how people around the world see the U.S. It's pretty wild to see all this happening just 2 months after we first dug into this boycott. The commitment from Canadian consumers and how businesses on both sides are reacting, it just goes to show the real-world power of trade tensions and consumer activism. This brings up a big question for you to think about. In a world where everything's so connected, what's the true cost and the true value of economic nationalism and these kinds of boycotts? It's a complicated issue with no easy answers, and what's going on between Canada and the US right now is a pretty fascinating case study. And hey, if you're finding these deep dives useful and want to help us out, please swing by our YouTube channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support really does make a difference.